Good evening, ISM members of Maharashtra. I, Dr. Santosh Kalsheti, Secretary of Solapur Anesthesiology Society, welcome you all on behalf of our Solapur Society, Anesthesiology Society and Maharashtra State Chapter of Indian Society for Anesthesiologists. Learning is an ongoing part and parcel of our life. For all medicals and before COVID pandemic, attending CME conference at site was the main avenue for gathering knowledge and for learning new skills. But due to COVID pandemic, group gathering has been stopped and we all have opted for online teaching in the form of webinars. So our first webinar topic is on latest trend in weight management by Dr. Nita Deshpande, madam, endocrinologist. We welcome Dr. Nita Deshpande madam, on behalf of Solapur Anesthesiology Society and Maharashtra State Chapter. Our second topic is use of balanced salt solution in COVID-19 patient by Dr. Sandeep Bhavkar. I welcome you, Dr. Sandeep, on behalf of SAS and Maharashtra State Chapter. Now I welcome Maharashtra State Chapter Council members, Dr. Milind Kaul, President Maharashtra State Chapter, Dr. Chandrasekhar Shah, Vice President, Dr. Manisha Katikar Madam, President-elect Maharashtra State Chapter, Dr. Balaji Asegapur, Secretary Maharashtra State Chapter, Dr. Sangeeta Deshpande, Treasurer, Dr. Shivangi Kotari Madam, E-Misa News Editor, and Dr. Ashok Deshpande, our National GC member. I welcome you all on behalf of Solapur Anesthesiology Society and Maharashtra ISA members. Now, I call Dr. Sangeeta Page Madam, President of the Solapur Anesthesiologists. She will introduce our speaker, Dr. Nita Deshpande. Over to Page Madam.
Hello, good evening all. I, Dr. Sangeeta Page, President Solapur Anesthesiology Society, welcome you all for today's webinar. We, as anesthesiologists, we usually start our day early in the morning around 6 to 7 a.m. For that, we wake up early, take a light snack and a cup of tea and start our day. We are not going to know how and when we will finish our cases. So, most of the times we have to adjust an emergency cases as and when in between our elective cases. Because of that, most of the times we do not get proper lunch at home. And after finishing all the cases, we come back evening around 5 to 6 p.m. at home. At that time, we feel more and more hungry and we are usually crave for carbohydrates and we eat junk food at that time and take a dinner late at night. Because of that, we will put on weight and leads to obesity. And also, because of stress, we are very prone for pre-diabetes, diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia at an early age in our life. To handle this scenario and face our anesthesia challenges and to enlighten this, we have an excellent speaker, Dr. Nita Deshpande, today. Let me introduce her first. Dr. Nita Deshpande is a diabetes and obesity expert who has been in service of patients for more than 20 years. She graduated from Jain Medical College, Belgaum, and pursued postgraduate studies MD in internal medicine from the same institute. After that, she has been certified for diabetes from the University of Newcastle, Australia, and for obesity from American Society of Bariatric Physicians. She holds a postgraduate diploma in endocrinology from the Queen Mary University, London. She is also a fellow of Royal College of Physicians, Edinburgh. She has undergone training and observerships in various institutes of repute such as Joslin Diabetes Center, Boston, Obesity Department of University of Alberta, Canada. Dr. Nita Deshpande is a crusader for lifestyle modification as means of preventing and treating non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, pre-diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, etc. She is an avid researcher and academician, having been active in research field and published and presented papers at national and international level in prestigious journals and conferences. She has authored chapters in textbook of diabetes and obesity. She is a prolific orator and is invited to address physicians and general practitioners across the country, delivering around 25 to 30 lectures in a year. She has been interviewed and been on national television on the issues related to diabetes and obesity. Over to you, ma'am. Dr. Deshpande, ma'am.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sangeeta, for that introduction. And at the outset, I would like to thank the Anesthesia Society for inviting me to talk on a subject which is not just my academic interest, but a passion as well. So I chose this topic, or rather, Dr. Sangeeta wanted me to address the Anesthesia Society on the latest trends in weight management. Now, you would wonder why anesthetists need to know about weight management. Well, this lecture is really not meant for your patients, but this is for yourselves, because all of us are in a very high burnout kind of a profession, a very unpredictable profession, and even amongst medicos, anesthetists have the most unpredictable lifestyle, as Dr. Sangeeta has already outlined. So that makes us very prone, that makes you people very prone to obesity, especially as age advances. And I'm going to show you some of the reasons why. So this lecture is going to touch you at a very personal level. So it is a very personal level talk on how to take care of yourselves and not get obese, because as you know today, all research has shown, and all of us already know, that obesity is the mother of all non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, cardiac disease, and now today cancer. So all of these non-communicable diseases have their roots in obesity, and we need to tackle this. We need to actually, the best thing to do is prevention of obesity. It's not the treatment, because once you become obese, it's a disease for life. So prevention of obesity is most important. But having said that, many of us do get overweight, we get obese, and then we need to know how to deal with it in the best possible manner. So with this introduction, I will share my slides. Before I begin, I just want to know, Dr. Sangeeta, how much time should I be speaking for?
minutes, ma'am. 40 minutes.
I beg your pardon?
Hello. 40 minutes.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Because I can just go on, and then I don't want everyone to get bored. And if you want, we can have a Q&A session at the end of it, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for that. Okay. So I'll begin by sharing my slides. Is it visible?
Yes.
All right. All right. So, as I said, I'm going to be talking about the latest trends in weight management. We can touch upon some of the controversies and some of the latest ads, how much of it is myth and how much of it is actually reality. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, the latest trends in weight management. So why is obesity so hard to treat? That is the question. Why does everybody struggle so much with weight loss? The reason for that is that many factors can contribute to weight gain. But as weight increases, the new elevated level of body weight is defended just as it had previously been. And removing the factors that cause the initial weight gain will not remove the excess weight. Many people think I eat less, I should lose weight. And if I've lost weight, I should be able to maintain it. That does not happen, because many a times the factors that initially cause the weight gain, those factors are not taken care of. Those are not removed, which means to say that every case of simple obesity actually has some causes. And for each person, those causes may be different. For you, it may be lifestyle. For somebody else, it may be emotional eating. For somebody else, it may be an age factor. For somebody else, it may be sex factor. So very briefly, I'm going to tell you the causes that actually, and you have to identify which cause works for you. It may not be one, it may be multiple causes. And unless that is taken care of, 1 minute. I think it's not advancing. Yeah. So these are the root causes of weight gain. As you can see here, you can just divide them into three major chunks of causes. You must know where you stand. Is it a slow metabolism because of your age, or because you are a female, or because there is some brown fat, which is not, I mean, brown fat is good, or is it post weight loss? That means you've already lost some weight, so your metabolism has slowed down, or do some medications do it? The other is increased energy intake. That means eating more. But eating more also can have causes, and those causes to be dealt with. Sometimes they could be just because of a knowledge deficit. You think you're eating less, but actually you're not. That means you don't know how many calories you're actually consuming, how much of carbohydrates you're actually consuming. So there's a knowledge deficit. Secondly, there could be a mindless eating. You're watching television or you're watching Netflix, and with that, you are just keeping on munching. So that's called mindless eating. Somebody could be having emotional eating. Reduced activity could be because of several reasons. It could be because of physical limitations. You have, say, osteoarthritis of the knees, so you can't really walk. So your activities are all limited. Or you have certain cardiorespiratory condition which precludes exercise for you, or there could be some other medications or barriers which cause all of these. It's very important to look at this slide and figure out where you actually picture what are your trigger factors for weight gain. Is it because of emotional eating, mindless eating, or is it because you don't exercise for a particular reason? So these are all the things that you must take care of before you decide why you're putting on. This is a slide that has been seen by many, and this is the total energy expenditure. And as you can see here that your basal metabolic rate, that means just at rest without doing anything at all, that actually contributes to 60 to 75%. And this very heavily depends upon fat-free mass. What do you mean by fat-free mass? You mean your muscle mass. So I'm going to come to this again a little later about fat-free mass, that is your muscle mass. That's very, very important, and your fat mass. And both of these things are quite dependent on your age. So that is very important. Then comes your thermic energy effect of food. That means how much you're eating. You can see here that this is about 10%, and physical activity, whether it's your exercise or whether it is just non-exercise activity thermogenesis, that is this part. So look at this implication of this. Your food intake accounts for 100% of energy that enters your body. Okay, that means you have full control over that, 100% of it. So what energy that comes in, 100% is dependent upon the food. However, what goes out, that is exercise, that burns only 10 to 30%. This itself should tell you one very important thing, that for weight loss, it is not exercise that is important, because only 10 to 30% is burned by exercise, where food intake accounts for 100% of your caloric intake, which means in practical terms, if you are looking to lose weight, it is diet that is important and not exercise. Does this mean you should not exercise? No. Exercise is important, but for very different reasons. Exercise is important for fitness. It is important for stamina. It is important for weight maintenance. But for weight loss, it is diet. That is very, very sure, and there are many studies to prove that. So that is the reason that I'm going to spend a little time on what we are going to talk about in the diet. Now, you are all doctors. All of you know that if you eat a reduced calorie diet, you're going to lose weight. That means you have to eat less, control your portion size, and you are going to lose weight. But is that all there is to it? That means you just eat less. Can you lose weight? I'm also going to talk to you from in a little about some of the more fat diets, like keto diet, paleo diet, low carb diet. All these diets I'm going to talk about in a nutshell. So, if you take any diet, okay, any diet that you are talking about, it can be a keto diet, it can be any kind of a diet, all of this will fall into five major chunks of diet, types of diet. So you have a low carbohydrate diet. So Atkins diet, keto diet, paleo diet, all of them come under low carbohydrate diet. Then you have the typical low fat diet, which everyone is asked to follow, especially after a heart attack. Don't eat cholesterol, don't eat oil, don't eat all of that. That is all low fat diet. Then there is a third one, which is a Mediterranean diet. Please remember, Mediterranean diet is the only diet that has actually got proof that it can reduce heart attacks. This is the only one that has got actual proof. Okay. And remember that this diet, Mediterranean diet, has got almost 40% fat in it. But the fat is in the form of MUFA, that is monounsaturated fatty acid, because we eat a lot of olive oil. But remember, this idea of low fat diet is not actually a proven diet. Everyone says don't eat fat, don't eat fat. But if you look at the literature, there is actually no proof that a low fat can actually translate into low heart attack or low cardiac outcomes. In fact, Mediterranean diet, which has 40%, 38 to 50% of fat, that has got the most proof for reducing cardiovascular outcomes. Then comes the low glycemic load. That means you eat less carbohydrates. So glycemic load means total carbohydrates, which is actually a low carb diet. And then is portion control. This last part is something that can be added to all the other diets above. That means you eat less, reduce your calories. So whether you are on low carb, low fat, Mediterranean, low calorie is also important. So all your major diets will fall into one of these. Now let's look at the high carbohydrate diet. Why you should not eat high carbohydrate diet? You will be surprised to know that a regular Indian vegetarian diet, north, south, east and west, has got 60 to 70% of carbohydrates, which is way too high, and that is the cause of the epidemic, the twin epidemic of diabetes and obesity, leading to an epidemic of cardiovascular disease. High carbohydrate diet can affect the body metabolically in various ways. It is pro-inflammatory. Please remember that in general, obesity is a disease of chronic inflammation. And that is why you find that today, COVID-19, the highest risk factor for mechanical ventilation and admission to ICU, the highest risk factor is obesity. Because obesity is a disease of chronic inflammation. And in a disease of chronic inflammation, a high carbohydrate diet causes more inflammation because there is a pro-inflammatory response with a high carbohydrate diet. And ultimately, this leads to hepatic inflammation and it leads to fatty liver, and fatty liver then leads to diabetes. So there's hepatic steatosis as well that can be caused, cholesterol deposition, etc. So a high carbohydrate diet is not a good idea for anybody. So high carbohydrate diet, like in India, 60, 65, 70%. So that is not at all a good idea. So if you want to go low carb, okay, definition of low carbohydrate diet in Western terms is actually a percentage that goes below 45 and 50. The rationale of carbohydrate restriction is that in response to lower glucose availability, there are changes in insulin and glucagon concentration, which will direct the body away from fat storage and towards fat oxidation. Remember that you do not get fat with a high fat diet, you get fat with a high carb diet. The reason is very simple, because carbohydrate can be stored in the body only in the form of glycogen, and glycogen stores get full very fast. Okay, so once glycogen stores are full, all the carbohydrate that you eat is directed towards the adipose tissue, and then it is deposited as triglycerides and fat. So a high carbohydrate diet ultimately leads to high triglycerides, it leads to fatty liver, and it leads to higher deposition of adipose tissue. It is not exactly high fat diet which leads to that. So if you want to reduce fat, you have to reduce your carbohydrates more than you have to reduce your fat. Recommended very low concentration of carbohydrate is 20 to 50. And this was the basis of the keto diet and the paleo diet. But in general practice, in medical practice, in obesity, you do not always have to as low as 50 grams of carbohydrate. You can go 50 grams is almost like zero carbohydrate. If you just bring down the percentage of carbohydrate in your diet from 65, 70%, if you just bring it down to 50 or 45%, for Indians, that is also a low carbohydrate. Okay. This typically, if you go very low to 50 grams, it leads to, you get ketones in the urine. So this is typically the ketogenic diet. When you go down to 50 grams of carbohydrates per day or less than that, then you are going to go into ketosis, and that is the basis of the ketogenic diet. However, for just a regular low carb diet, not a ketogenic diet, if you go down to just about 100 grams of carbohydrates per day, it is more than enough. Remember that an Indian vegetarian diet has anywhere between 150 to 200 grams of carbohydrates per day, which is way too high. When you go on a low carb diet, it is a ketogenic diet. So when you go low carb, something else has to go high. So it is either the fat that goes high or the protein that goes high, or both of them go high. If the fat goes high, then the fuel source is both ketone bodies as well as gluconeogenesis. And if you go on a high protein diet, when you are on a low carb diet, then the source of energy or fuel is gluconeogenesis. So remember that ketogenesis and gluconeogenesis take over when you go on a low carb ketogenic diet. That is the most important thing to remember. So this is typically a ketogenic diet where the fat is very high to the tune of 75% and carbs are just 5%. This translates into less than 50 grams of carbohydrates per day and protein is at around 20%. So this is a typical ketogenic diet. However, there are different kinds of ketogenic diets where what I told you before just now is the standard ketogenic diet, which is just 20 to 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. But there is something called cyclical ketogenic diet. That means you consume a low carb keto for multiple days, you alternate it with a couple of days of higher carb, and then go back on a keto. So this is called a cyclical keto. And there are various ways of doing a keto diet. But there are certain adverse effects which you should be aware of. It can lead to bad breath, like a ketotic breath, change in bowel habits, obviously, because it's such a high fat diet. So there is very less fiber. So you can get constipated and you can have loss of energy if it is not properly monitored. Please remember one thing, ketogenic diet is a diet that can be prescribed by nutritionists and obesity physicians, but it should be done under supervision. The important thing to remember is if you do a ketogenic diet by just looking at the internet, then it becomes a fad diet because the adverse events are not monitored, ketosis is not monitored. So the pros and cons of a ketogenic diet are shown in this particular slide. That the pros are it causes good bit of weight loss. It is anti-inflammatory because I tell you, high carb is pro-inflammatory. Here you're cutting off the carbs, so it is anti-inflammatory. It is supposed to have certain anti-cancer properties, improved blood lipids actually, improved immune function, obviously because the inflammation goes down, and it is beneficial for reaching low insulin levels. This last line is very important for us to remember. Remember that the biggest driver of insulin secretion is carbohydrate. High insulin levels lay down fat because it is an anabolic hormone. So the idea is that you want insulin levels to be low so that fat oxidation occurs and there is no laying down of fat. So if you want to reduce your insulin levels, your carbs have to be low. So if you go as low as a ketogenic diet, you will reach very low levels of insulin, which helps the weight loss. Of course, there are a lot of cons to it. There are lots of minerals. It is very restrictive. It's not easy to follow because such a high fat diet, continuously eating only non-vegetarian food, eating only fats and absolutely no carbs is not easy. So adherence becomes a problem and it's a totally new way of eating. And in an ideal situation, you should be measuring glucose and ketones twice a day. And there will be nutrition deficiencies which have to be looked into and they have to be made good by giving supplements. Next, you come to another new diet, which is the paleo diet. Now, this is not a new diet. It is simply a diet which was actually the diet of our ancestors who were hunter-gatherers, which means what is actually found in the forest in a natural form, like nuts, berries, leaves, okay, and lean meat. All of these things are a paleo diet. So basically, all these things which are found in nature comes out. This is the paleo diet, and it is not easy to follow, and the adherence rates are very low. Then comes the last part about the diet. We can discuss more about it in the Q&A if you wish to do that. The last part of a type of diet is the AI diet. By AI, I mean artificial intelligence. You must have heard of the topic called nutrigenomics. That means that by genetics, each one of us may be handling our carbs differently, may be handling our fats differently based on our genes. So there are certain centers which actually do something called nutrigenomics. That means match your macronutrient metabolism to your genes and accordingly prescribe a designer diet. And this has come in the lay press. But nutrigenomics is being done, it is expensive, but we don't know how effective it is. It is not yet mainstream. It simply means that it's a highly individualized diet based on how you will be handling your proteins, how you will be handling your fats. Because somebody may be handling carbohydrates very well. So that person did not have carbohydrate restriction. What the diets that we do now are actually a shot in the dark because we do not know how a particular person is going to react to carbohydrates and fats. We just go by a majority and we go by the studies that we have. So artificial intelligence may be here to stay because as we know in medicine, one size never fits all. Okay. Now coming to an important part which everybody has been reading these days and everyone is talking about, and that is intermittent fasting. So should we do intermittent fasting? Should we not do intermittent fasting? Does it have benefits? Is it easy to do? Can you get weight loss with that? Well, yes and no. Since we're discussing weight loss, let me tell you that intermittent fasting is good for weight loss provided you follow it in the right pattern. By intermittent fasting, it simply means that you have periods of fasting and then you have periods of eating. So it is not exactly time restricted eating. These are two different terminologies. Intermittent fasting is there and then you have time restricted eating. Sometimes the distinction is blurred and you think, and they could both be used synonymously. Intermittent fasting simply means that for a long period of time you are fasting and for a smaller period of time you are eating whatever you're supposed to eat. What is the fundamental behind this? The fundamental behind this is that during the fasting period, your insulin levels drop. When your insulin levels drop, then you do not lay down, it's, as I told you, it's an anabolic hormone. You break down fat. You do not accumulate fat, you actually break down fat. So your insulin levels are getting reduced. During the eating period, okay, you're eating for a short period. If during the eating period, now remember this, intermittent fasting is not a panacea. If during the eating period you eat anything and everything, you may not lose weight. There is a reason for this. One is the calories that go in, ultimately they also matter, and the kind of food that you eat. Because the idea of reducing your insulin levels during the fasting period, this is overshadowed if during the eating period you're going to eat huge amount of carbohydrates. Then what is going to happen? You eat a lot of carbohydrate during the eating period, that is the feeding period. Insulin levels go high. Insulin levels go high and they counteract the good effect of the low insulin levels that you achieved during the fasting period. So if you want to complement the low insulin levels that you achieve during the fasting period, then during the feeding period of intermittent fasting, you must eat low carbohydrate diet. That is the fundamental. So if you want to lose weight, if you want to maintain weight, what you eat during that feeding period is as important as the length of the fasting period. So this is one important principle of intermittent fasting. Is it safe? Yes, it is safe because it does not do anything to your body. Remember, intermittent fasting is something that our grandmothers used to do. They used to eat once a day, they used to eat twice a day. That was nothing but intermittent fasting. What is Ekadashi? Ekadashi is nothing but intermittent fasting. Of course, if you are the kind of person who does Ekadashi with sabudana khichdi and pariche tandoor and all of those things, then that is not intermittent fasting. But there were our ancestors, our grandmothers who used to do real Ekadashi without even water. That is real intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting does not really harm the body unless one is prone to acidity or gastric reflux or something. That's a different thing. Otherwise, intermittent fasting is safe. You're not doing anything over there. The other thing is, intermittent fasting is not a separate kind of a diet. It is just the timing. So, you could be on a keto diet and you could be still doing intermittent fasting. You could be on a low calorie diet or any other paleo diet or an Atkins diet and you could still be doing intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting is simply a method of eating that can be applied to any kind of diet that you are doing. So you can do any kind of diet and just apply intermittent fasting to it. So it is as simple. There are many forms of intermittent fasting. The commonest one that is followed is 16-8. That means you fast for 16 hours and whatever you have to eat, you eat it in 8 hours. There is something called 14-10. And then there are some people 24 hours. That means it's a 24-hour fast. They do it 3 times a week. Or this is a 5-by-2 method. That means for 5 days you are eating regular and for 2 days you are fasting, which will allow you only 500 calories per day. Different ways of doing it. But these are the purported effects of intermittent fasting, good effects on various organs of the body. For example, look at the liver. Increased insulin sensitivity, and there is ketone body production because you're fasting. There's starvation ketosis for 16 hours. And then ketosis is the fuel to be burnt, so it burns fat. Increased insulin sensitivity at the level of the muscles, so on and so forth. So you have several ways in which you can actually do this. Okay. Next, we come to physical activity. So since we are talking about weight loss, I've talked to you about the controversies and the newer kind of diets and dietary strategies. Now we come to physical activity. Please remember that exercise should never be of just one type. Physical activity is different, exercise is different. Physical activity is simply the activity in the routine course of the day. Now you are anesthetist, you're standing for 4 hours, you're standing for 5 hours at a time. That is physical activity. Okay. Then if you're just supposing you walk to work, okay, or you take the stairs, or you instead of the lift, so that is physical activity. So that is activity during a little increased activity during the routine course of the day. Whereas exercise is a separate structured activity for which you have allotted a certain amount of time and you do a specific kind of activity, that is exercise. What kind of exercise should you be doing for weight loss and weight maintenance? Well, exercise should be of different types, but 2 of the main types which must be done by everybody, I will tell you why, is one is aerobic. By aerobic, I mean your cardio exercises, which could be running, skipping, jumping, or sprinting, jogging, walking, cycling, swimming. All of this is cardio exercise. Whereas strength training is resistance exercise. Both components are extremely important. And flexibility, yoga, stretching, floor exercises, that is all flexibility. So if you ask me, is yoga good? I'll say yes, it is good, but you also need to be doing these other things. So this brings me to my next slide. This is one of my favorite slides because this is for fat loss. This is the hierarchy. On one side, you have intensity of exercise, and on the other, the time required for that exercise. So look at, say, for example, jogging. Okay, jogging is at the top of the pyramid. That means the intensity is intermediate and the time required is intermediate for this. Whereas if you take resistance training, for example, okay, it is in the middle somewhere. But look at circuit training, CrossFit training, or HIIT, that is high intensity interval training. It all comes here. This is high intensity and takes very little time. So as doctors and anesthetists, you can actually think of incorporating this into your regimen, that is circuit training, because you need less time and it is of high intensity. Yoga is not a bad activity, but look at where it is on the pyramid. It requires a lot of time and the intensity is very low. So if you want benefit from yoga alone, you'll have to do it for a long time. So you will have to do a combination of all these things. So this is the slide. Now coming to why we should do strength training. Now this is sarcopenia or aging. See, as you age, as you and I age, both men and women, okay, this is the thigh muscle area, this is the knee extensor strength. So your strength starts to drop as you age and your muscle mass starts to reduce as you age. And see, this is what happens. So as you age, if you had to do knee extension, look at the age groups and the peak torque that is achieved keeps on reducing as you age from your 50s to the 60s, it keeps on reducing. How can you circumvent this, or how can you slow down the slope? By doing resistance training, muscle strength training. In the same way, aerobic capacity also changes with age. As you age, your VO2 max starts to reduce. So you have to work on all these things. You have to work on your aerobics and you have to work on strength training, all of these things. How does resistance training work, or strength training, or weight training as it is called? It causes microscopic damage or tear to the muscle cells, and then these are repaired by the body to help muscles regenerate and grow stronger. Which means to say that because there is microscopic damage, you should not do resistance training every day. At least the same groups of muscles should not be done every day, because you have to give one day in between for it to heal. And while it is healing, muscle is built up. So muscles heal and grow between the workouts, not when you're doing the muscle. When you're doing strength training, when you're lifting the dumbbells, it is not that time that your muscle is being built. The muscle is being built in the rest period, the next day, because that's when the healing is happening. So that is why periods of recovery between the workouts are very, very important. Next, coming to another thing that has caught on in big way, and some of you might be doing it, is HIIT. What is HIIT? It is high intensity interval training. What does that mean? High intensity interval training means any kind of exercise, if you have bursts of increased intensity for 2 minutes, 3 minutes in between, and then come back to baseline intensity, that is called HIIT. So HIIT is not a different kind of exercise. HIIT can be applied to any kind of exercise. So HIIT is intermittent fasting of exercise. So simply put, intermittent applied to any diet and HIIT applied to any exercise, just to ramp up the intensity. That is all it is. So typically it involves repeated bouts of high intensity effort, and in between you have recovery. Now the high intensity effort can be 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes based on your fitness level, and recovery period can be 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, again based on your fitness level, and you can increase it. So today your HIIT may be having high intensity period of 3 minutes, but as you become fitter, it may become 5 minutes. So just like intermittent fasting can go from 14:10 to 16:8, same way HIIT also intensity can increase, recovery period also can be reduced. So these are examples of the HIIT. This is the one I like best. Simply in 20 minutes, you can get all the good effects of what you want to do. So you warm up with a 5-minute walk, you sprint, that is run for 30 seconds only, and then you jog for 3 minutes, and then do again a 30-second sprint, you walk for 1 minute, and then you repeat this whole process 3 times. So altogether 20 minutes. Your HIIT workout is over. This you can do for anything. Now this is another HIIT workout. You do a continuous jumping jack, wall sit, push up, crunches, chair stepper, all that you see here. You do all of this, then do a recovery period, then repeat the whole thing. So this is how you do it. Then coming to medication. So I've covered diet, I've covered exercise. Now we come to pharmacology. The only, I call it the Lone Ranger because the only drug that is approved today in India for pure obesity treatment is Orlistat. I have never used it. I have been in practice basically of diabetes for 25 years now and about 20 years in obesity. But I had never used Orlistat. In fact, it is the only drug available. The weight loss is as little as this. Look at this. It is such a small weight loss, 3 kg, 4 kg at the end of 6 months, 12 months. I can achieve 10 kg just with a lifestyle modification. Of course, maintenance is difficult. I don't say no. And Orlistat is a lipase inhibitor. So if a person is on a very high fat diet, then it works. Indians are not on a very high fat diet, and so it doesn't work. This brings me to the next promising molecule, and that is liraglutide. Liraglutide is called a GLP-1 receptor agonist. It is injectable subcutaneously. It has to be taken every day. It is once a day. It is approved for treatment of diabetes, but it causes huge amount of weight loss. I was involved in the clinical trials of liraglutide as a obesity treatment, and it worked fabulously well. And that is why it was approved by the FDA for use in the dose of 3 milligrams as opposed to a maximum dose of 1.8 milligrams for diabetes is used for as 3 milligrams as pure obesity treatment. Unfortunately, it is not licensed to be used for pure obesity in India, only diabetes obese patients. But off label, we do use liraglutide and it gives very good results in some and no results in some others. It is injectable on a daily basis. So this is a slide again, which is one of my, which actually tells you the weight loss with various different kinds of methods that you can use. As you can see here, the highest weight loss that you have of around, let's say 3.5, not, this is not the highest, 3.5 kg is what you are getting with drugs. But the highest weight loss, look at this gray dots that you see, it's meal replacement. What are meal replacement? Liquid meal formulas that are used as very low calorie diets. My expertise is in this field, and I have been using and I have published and I speak about reversal of diabetes and reversal of obesity with the use of liquid meal replacements. And you can see this meta-analysis where you are getting the maximum effect and maintenance only for this. And you can see here that, so this is why I have highlighted this. And look at this. This is no effect. And what is this pink? This pink is exercise. So you can see here that exercise is not a means for weight loss, it's only for weight maintenance. And all the other things that you use, high protein diet, other macronutrients, they are all in this area. But you see that the best results that you are getting is for meal replacement. Look at this over here. So the gray thing that you see here, the higher, the best effect that you have seen is with meal replacements. As I said, I use them extensively. There is a third dimension to all of this, and the third dimension to all of this is change in behavior. No diet is ever going to work if you do not change your behavior, if you do not change your attitude. That's not going to happen. Next comes bariatric surgery. I'm going to show you only one slide on bariatric surgery because today, if you read on Medscape, the newest study that has come out in New England Journal of Medicine, published online this morning, this very morning, has shown that bariatric surgery and medical management of weight loss are equal in terms of metabolic parameters. There's no difference. You can get weight loss by any means, and the effect is going to be the same. However, sustenance or maintenance of weight loss is much easier with bariatric surgery, as you can see in this particular slide. Now, this is the last part of my talk, and this last part is the most important part of my talk, and that is weight loss maintenance. Please remember that weight loss is extremely easy. You do any diet, patient is motivated, starts really, on a crash diet, the doctor is happy, the patient is happy, the dietitian is happy, everybody is happy, and this goes on for 6 to 8 months. And then starts the problem. That is, slowly the patient starts to get hungry, the patient starts to get bored of the diet, adherence levels come down, and slowly the weight starts creeping back up to a point where the patient may actually reach a weight that is higher than where he started. So weight loss maintenance is the most important thing to remember. So less than 1/5 of individuals who achieve a 10% reduction in body weight successfully maintain that weight loss after 1 year. And why is that? There is a phenomenon called energy gap. Look at these first two things. When you are obese, your intake, expenditure equal, you remain obese. You lost weight for some time, intake, energy at a lower level than the obesity, again, you have a weight loss. But after some time, these individuals who have reduced their weight, there are hormonal changes which occur. The neuroendocrine axis comes into play. Hormones such as ghrelin, which are produced by the stomach, they increase, and energy expenditure reduces, giving rise to what is called as the energy gap. So the energy gap is nothing but increased appetite and reduced energy expenditure, and all our strategies, behavioral, dietary, pharmaceutical, all of these strategies are geared towards reducing this energy gap so that the weight loss is maintained. Having said that, whatever strategies you use, okay, there are other things that are important. The gut hormone changes, which opposite, I already told you that there are changes, especially in ghrelin and leptin. Weight loss is a challenge because physiologically it is perceived as a dysfunction. All of you know about the thrifty gene hypothesis, which means simply don't bother about looking at this slide. I'm just telling you in simple words what it is. When we were hunter-gatherers, we never knew when the next meal was going to come from. So what we started doing was we started eating lots at one time, and our body learned to store all of that because we didn't know whether we would get a meal tomorrow. So we should not starve. So the accumulation of fat and the accumulation of energy was done as a safety mechanism so that if there was a famine, we will still have our energy stores within our body. But those genes remained with us, but the environment changed because agriculture came in 10,000 years ago. And when agriculture came in, there was no scarcity. We had food all the year round. We had abundance of food. We had as much food as we wanted. So those genes which had learned to store the fat, they continued to store the fat despite the fact that we had no famine, we had no scarcity of food. And that is the thrifty gene hypothesis. That is the genesis of obesity. So the genesis of obesity is not 2 decades or 3 decades old. I would say it is 10,000 years old when actually agriculture started. We started growing cereals and crops which were not there in the hunter-gatherer days, and that's how we started becoming fat. And this gene is the one that is posing the greatest challenge to weight loss, because when you eat less, the body perceives it as starvation. It starts to store more and more food, and that is why those hormonal changes happen, and the weight maintenance becomes a challenge. So weight loss maintenance is dependent upon several factors, okay? Drugs, physical activity, the diet, whether you continue to do the diet or not, and then other health concerns, whether you're depressed or not, and the most important thing is the face-to-face or web-based intervention, in the sense that I'm going to show you a very short study. Let me go directly to that study, and that is this one. This was a study which showed that as long as the first 6 months after the weight loss, that means people lost weight in the first 3 months, and after that, for 6 months, 1/2 of the patients were kept in touch with the obesity center, and the other half did not keep in touch. Okay, the ones that kept in touch continued to lose weight or at least maintain weight, and the ones who lost touch, okay, they actually put on weight. And after those 6 months, everybody lost touch with the obesity clinic, and after 1 year they came back and everybody had put on weight again. What does this mean? It means that if you keep in touch with your obesity physician, with your nutrition, come what may, even if your weight is stagnant, you should keep in touch, and that's the only way that you can maintain weight. The other ways that you can maintain weight are low GI diets, that means low glycemic index diet and low carbohydrate diets. High protein, they cause satiety and hence they may help in weight maintenance, and they preserve lean body mass. I've already told you that if you preserve muscle mass, you are more likely to maintain weight. The reason is that muscle mass burns more fat, whereas adipose tissue does not allow you to burn fat or burn calories. So you have to preserve lean body mass, and you can preserve lean body mass by doing two things. One is resistance training or strength training, and second thing is increasing your protein intake. So that is very important, and this is required for weight maintenance. This I have already talked about. This is a data from my own patients of 60 patients. It's a simple study. This is the baseline they start. These are the mean weight. They started at 86. At the end of 2 months, they came down to 77. I told you I use a lot of meal replacements and liquid formulas. At the end of 3 months, they came down again. And at the end of, these are time points of 6 months and 1 year. At the end of 1 year, they had still continued to lose weight. And the only reason for that is we keep in touch with the patients, we badger the patients, we phone the patients, we email the patients to come. And that is the reason that it is showing a downward trend. The minute you stop that, it straightway goes back up. So the importance for weight maintenance is high protein diet, resistance training, HIIT. I have not added intermittent fasting here, but intermittent fasting also helps to maintain weight. If at all required, then drugs. And then most important is follow. So please remember that these are all the things that you need to do to lose weight. Now, husbands and wives are equal partners, but they have different but complementary responsibilities. And here the husband is the diet, the wife is the exercise. So diet, exercise, both have got different responsibilities. They're complementary to each other. This is for weight maintenance, very, very important. The other important thing is your behavior change. Extremely important. If your behavior, if your outlook, everyone says, I'm a foodie, so I cannot stop eating. So that is change in behavior. You're being a foodie and you're accepting it and not trying to change it is going to make you relapse, and you are going to go on to that yo-yo diet kind of a scale. So remember that we can eat food without chapati, rice, roti. If you get into the habit of creating such a plate for yourself at least once a day, instead of one major meal, at least once a day, if you can do this, then you have actually made it. So this is, I'm an avid cyclist. I cycle several kilometers on a daily basis. And I also cycle for days together in different countries of the world. It's a passion. If you make your exercise as your passion, then you will never stop it. It does not become boring. So for some people, gymming may be interesting. For me, gymming is not at all interesting because I want to be out with nature. For somebody else, dancing may be a passion. So whatever it is that you take up, you must love it, and only then you will continue to follow it. Don't do it like it is a compulsion. It should become a passion. And I shall stop here, and I'm willing to take any questions. I'm sure a lot of you might have tried different diets, different exercises, might have actually reached a weight loss plateau, or relapsed after having lost weight. So to the best of my ability, it would be nice to interact with you. Thank you all once again for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about a very passionate subject. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. It's very
That's right.
informative talk and solve most of the queries, but we have to take some questions, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Ma'am, first question is, can you elaborate for simple and complex carb? If the calorie content of both the simple and complex carb is same, then which is better and why?
Well, the difference between simple and complex carb is the ability to drive the insulin response. Simple carbohydrates will cause a sudden spike in glucose, so there will be a sudden spike in insulin, and that spike may remain there. And as I told you, insulin lays down fat. Whereas complex carbohydrates, especially those that have a lot of fiber in them, they they raise the glucose a little more slowly. The curve is a little flatter, and so the insulin response is also flatter, and hence it does not give you that much of a response. So the idea is that you should, the carbohydrate should be absorbed slowly, and that is what happens with complex carb. It's not just calories that matter; the kind of calories also matter. That is the important part here.
Okay, got it, ma'am. Second question is saturated and unsaturated fat, and which oil should be used routinely in our cooking?
Well,
Which
when
is
you're
better?
considering oil, yeah, when you're considering oil, you have to consider saturated and unsaturated fat. Saturated fat, typically, according to guidelines, they say 10%, 15%. But as I said right in the beginning, this high fat diet causing problems to us is largely industry driven. So I'm not going to go into the details of that, but you have to limit your saturated fats, no doubt, but they are not completely harmful. So in limitations, they can be taken. But for the major part, our consumption should be polyunsaturated fatty acids and more importantly, monounsaturated fatty acids like olive oil. But having said that, it is all when you're taking your polyunsaturated fatty acids, the important thing to remember is the omega 6 to omega 3 ratio. So that also is very important. Omega 6 to omega 3 ratio should not actually exceed 4 is to 1, ideally, but it can go up to 10 is to 1. And the ideal ratio is found in mustard oil, it is found in ghee also, it is found in groundnut oil, soya oil. So these are oils which have got a favorable omega 6 to omega 3 ratio. So that is very important. Whereas your sunflower, safflower oil have got 130, 160 is to 1. They're very high in omega 6. So that is why they are not preferred. So you can actually mix your oils, or you can use alternatively. 1 month you can use soya oil. 1 month you can use rice bran oil. Another month you can use groundnut oil. So this is how you can keep on changing the oils. Of course, the quantity of oil is also important.
Yes. And about intermittent fasting,
Yeah.
I want to ask if intermittent fasting in the morning, and is there any connection between catch up of infection in means this pandemic? If we are NBM means nil by
See,
mouth
if
for
you're, yeah, now the thing is that when you're doing intermittent fasting or dieting of any kind, a problem is that people do not do all their tests. So you don't know your B12, you don't know your D, and you don't know all of that. So when you're going on a low calorie diet or an intermittent fasting, your basic nutrition has to be well maintained. You will, if you're going on a low calorie diet or a very low calorie diet, several supplements are required. And if those supplements are being taken in the right way, and if all your parameters are normal, I don't see a reason why you should not do it. In fact, it raises your immunity
okay.
because a lot of food causes oxidative stress, reactive oxygen species, and that can again lead to inflammation. As I said, obesity is a state of chronic inflammation.
Okay. And about all the diet plans, like means for keto diet, is it works on negative balance or
Negative balance in the sense?
means negative calorie balance?
Yes, ultimately, see
Or
what happens is keto diet typically they don't pay much attention to the calories because it
yeah.
works in a very different way. Ketosis, once it sets in, it suppresses appetite. You don't really have to count your calories. So it takes about a week or so for ketosis to actually set in. And the ketosis that happens with the keto diet is of a very small magnitude. It is not like the ketosis that happens in diabetic ketoacidosis or anything like that. It is just about 5 to 6 millimoles as compared to what you get in diabetic ketoacidosis. It was very, very high. So there should not be a problem.
Means it is said that calorie count is not much important, means you can take an
Yes.
extra fat in
Yes,
keto.
exactly what I'm saying, because it is once the ketosis happens, it's a very efficient fuel, so it burns the fat very well. So then you don't really have to pay attention to your calories. That's the thing about keto diet. It's difficult to follow because the restrictions on what kinds of food you can eat are so many, and that is why the adherence is low. It's not because of calories. Calories, actually, there is no restriction. It
Okay.
works very differently.
Okay. Hello, Santosh.
Yes, madam.
Are there any questions?
Yes,
from
yes.
you?
There are a lot of questions.
Okay.
Thank you, madam. It was a wonderful and healthy session. It is healthy, it's a very healthy session. Uh, so, lot of invitees are asking questions. Uh, one as Dr. Purnima has asked, is what about the people having people if the patients are handicapped or having osteoarthritis? How should they do the exercises
Yes. So that's a
and
very
obesity?
good question, actually. Yeah. So there is, see, exercise prescription is very important. Just like you have a medicine prescription, you have a diet prescription. There is something called an exercise prescription. Unfortunately, we don't have courses in India, but there is somebody called an exercise physiologist. So an exercise physiologist is one who takes into account all these and designs exercises for people taking their comorbidities and disabilities in mind. For example, now a person who has knee osteoarthritis, we are not going to ask that person to go for a walk or do cardio, right? So the person has to do non-weight bearing exercises. So how are non-weight bearing exercises done? You can either they'll have to go to the gym probably and have rowing machines, hand machines. Okay, so there are several exercises which are designed for people who can't use weight bearing exercises. So these can be used for them. If the osteoarthritis is not very severe, cycling either outside or a stationary cycling where there is no weight bearing, that can help. So it has to be designed, and then weight training can be done with upper body weights also. So it has to be designed based on the person's disability, and sometimes you will need the services of a physiotherapist. Because we don't have an exercise physiologist, a physiotherapist can be very, very useful in designing exercises for people who have these kind of disabilities.
Another question. It's controversial. Dr. Vaishali has asked, what is your opinion on Divekar and Dixit?
So yeah, so that is the question that is always asked. Quaker diet, I don't think anybody uses now because it has been debunked several times. Because the diets that I will say it very openly because I don't fear anyone. The diets that she uses, writes in her books and in her videos is very different from the diets that she will give Kareena Kapoor. They absolutely they can, there is no doubt about that. Secondly, today there is enough evidence to tell you that you do not have to eat every 2 hours. In fact, the more number of times that you eat, the more oxidative stress you are going to cause. There are very elegant studies by Dr. Paresh Dandona of the US who says that every time you eat, you are actually creating an oxidative stress, inflammation, because you are eating so many macronutrients, and you do not have to do that. So you can see it is diametrically opposite to intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting has got a lot of basis to it. It has got a lot of science to it because you're actually reducing the oxidative stress, the reactive oxygen species, etc. You're not doing that by eating every 2 hours. The problem with Divekar diet, or rather the attraction of Divekar diet, is she says and writes in her book all the things that you want to hear. Now you want to hear that I can eat lot of mangoes. You love to hear that, so you follow the Divekar diet. She says eat what is locally grown with your environmental consciousness. So you eat everything that is growing. So it is, you have to understand that science has to be involved in this. Ultimately, we come down to studies, randomized controls, trials, etc. So that is my opinion of Vivekar diet. You do not have to eat every 2 hours. Today, we have such fantastic anti-diabetic agents that even diabetics don't have to eat every 2 hours. In fact, there are many diabetics who, on the right kind of anti-diabetic agents, can also do intermittent fasting. So, where is the question of eating every 2 hours? Not required. That is about that. As far as Dikshit diet is concerned, I will say 2, 3 things. If you go actually on to YouTube, I have a 45-minute lecture in which one of this I have talked also about the Dikshit diet. Now, the Dikshit diet says eat twice a day. So he takes a little bit from intermittent fasting and a little bit on, but I know he is a qualified medical doctor, but if you look at the first two studies that came out from him, the first two studies, he himself writes that this is not for diabetic patients. Okay, he himself writes, I can quote, I have the studies there with me. The first study that he did was for general public, then pre-diabetic, not for diabetics. And in fact, he says that it is a preventive measure. So for people who want to lead just a good life and who are not looking actually for weight loss, but who are looking to prevent maybe obesity, to a certain extent it can help. I do not say no to that, because when you eat only twice, obviously you may not be able to eat a whole lot. But on the contrary, I have seen many people, family, friends, and anecdotes where people wait for those 2 meal times, gather everything that they ever want to eat, and eat all of that at one time, saying that nothing is going to happen. So there are a lot of myths about it, especially people in the IT industry, people who have erratic lifestyle. And they say we eat only twice. What do you eat during that time? Very, very important. I told you during intermittent fasting that what you eat in the feeding period is actually more important than the benefits that you have gained in the fasting period. So please be aware that you cannot eat anything and everything. So if you eat a low carb food in the Dikshit diet, if you eat very less, if you eat very sensibly, you are going to lose weight. Of course, you are going to lose weight because it is intermittent fasting. It is nothing new. It is very, very well known. But the way it has been propagated, it has been given a name. He has just given his own name to it. That is all it is. But it is just intermittent fasting with a twist, is what I would say. But what you eat during the feeding period has to be pre-specified. Otherwise, it is going to cause more damage and more problems. Third important thing is when diabetic patients or even non-diabetic patients do this kind of a diet and eat too much at one time, what is going to happen? They are going to have high postprandial sugars. Even non-diabetic patients can have this. So what will that do? That causes oxidative stress. Third, very high blood sugars for brief periods of time increases what we call glycemic variability. When glycemic variability increases, it causes endothelial dysfunction. So endothelial dysfunction is the genesis point of cardiovascular disease. So you can't be feasting that much at one time. So it has to be done very, very with a caveat. It has to be done with a lot of care and under supervision. I am totally against doing these kind of diets without medical supervision. So you can't read Dikshit diet on the internet and start doing it yourself. You have to do it under medical supervision because there are and remember one thing, one size never fits all. I told you this is the era of artificial intelligence and genomics, where each person has a different response to different kinds of macronutrients. That being the case, how can you give the same diet to everybody? And how can you say that this diet will benefit everybody? You give the same anti-diabetic agents to two different patients? You cannot do that. Why do you give more metformin in one and more sulfonylurea in the other? Because one has got more insulin resistance, one has got more insulin deficiency. In the same way, one diet cannot be the same for all. And that is the reason that obesity physicians have to actually, by trial and error, if they don't have access to nutrigenomics, by trial and error, we come to know who responds better to carbs, who responds better to fats. So I hope that has answered the question.
Thank you, madam. Another question is keto diet is contraindicated in diabetes patients?
Not exactly. It all depends upon what kind of anti-diabetic agents they're taking. If they are on insulin, then it depends on what kind of insulin they're taking. So it is not like it is contraindicated, but it has to be very carefully monitored, very carefully tailored, and a diabetologist, endocrinologist, and a nutrition who is well versed with keto diet, they have to be involved in it, then it can be tried.
Another question, madam. How will you manage in children because they will eat and they will not exercise? Obese
Yes.
children.
Yeah, so obesity in children is a different ball game altogether, because there it is not just what the child is eating, it is the parental practices also. So parental practices in childhood, such as there are two extremes. One is force feeding, okay, and the second is too much of restriction. So when you do force feeding of healthy food, the child comes to hate it as, because the child comes to see it as a punishment and starts hating that healthy food, and the foundation that has been laid is very, very bad. When you restrict certain foods, then the child starts to crave for those kind of foods, and this can ultimately lead to eating disorders. So parental practices are very, very important. Second thing is what parents themselves do. What is the environment in the house? We call it an obesogenic environment. What is an obesogenic environment? The environment within the home, within the school, and around what is available, what the child eats in the dabba, what is given to the child. All these things are very, very important in treating obesity in a child. So when we are treating a obese child, we actually teach the parents how to tackle all of this. And instead of the quantity, we focus first on the quality of food. We focus on the natural foods for the children. So these are various, there are several things that we have to do for a child. And all of these are important. Behavior practices, especially of the home, are very, very important. And we do not do these keto diets and intermittent fasting, and all of these kind of diets are not done in children.
Thank you. And last question. Does our diet habit, our high carbohydrate diet, 70% carbohydrate, is it related to highest number of diabetes patients in India?
Of course it is. There are studies to show that. Dr. V. Mohan has done a lot of studies, and he has done it across India, and he has actually proven that the high carbohydrate intake is indeed responsible for the diabetes epidemic in India. It is. There are several studies, not only here, but even abroad, where they have linked high carbohydrate diet not only to diabetes, but also to high incidence of cardiovascular disease. And there are several mechanisms by which this happens. It's not just through diabetes.
Are sugar-free products, madam, are harmful to the health? Sugar-free products contains
Yes,
artificial sugars.
Artificial sweeteners, yes and no. Artificial sweeteners, initially when they were approved by the FDA, were thought to be completely harmless. Even today, 1 or 2 tablets of, say, sugar-free, natural, sucralose, even up to 3 to 4 is not harmful. But more than that, it is harmful. There are certain neurological manifestations, and more importantly, what they found is that the gut microbiota is unfavorably affected by these artificial sweeteners, and hence they say that you should not use it in excess. So that is another thing, and it also has some effect on the neurohormonal axis, which actually makes you eat more. So in that sense, yes, we should try to do away with it.
Last question. Can you prescribe Maharashtrian diet which contains 50% carbohydrate?
Can you prescribe a?
Prescribe Maharashtrian diet. We all Maharashtrian having
Of course,
almost
yeah.
60 to 70%.
Yes, we can. I'll tell you how it is. I will not be able to tell you the exact percentage, but I can tell you what you can do. At least for 2 meals of the day, you get rid of cereals. Cereals such as everything. See, under cereal manje tandoor, gahu, all of these, everything is a cereal. So if you can get rid of that, okay, then you will ask me, what should I eat? Okay, so you can have, mostly what it boils down to is vegetables. So you can have vegetables in various forms. You can eat dal in various forms. You can make different preparations made of different kinds of dal. If you can get rid of cereal for 2 meals of the day and only have it for the third meal, definitely your weight will come down, your sugars will come down, everything comes down. It's just a habit. For example, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture to show you, but supposing you have a plate and you have 3 katoris, 1 katori has curds, 1 katori has dal, and 1 katori has vegetables, and you just eat it with a spoon. So your stomach is full, okay, and you can have one more katori of usad also if you wish. But do not eat it with chapati, roti, rice, at least for 2 meals of the day. And your uppit, pohe, idli, dosa, thalipit, all of that is cereal. So if you eat that every day, then if that is this, then the other 2 meals, then you don't have cereal. You try this for 1 or 2 weeks and you see the difference in your body and you see the lightness that you feel if you do that.
Thank you,
And
madam.
yeah,
Yeah, fine. Thank you, madam. We are running out of time.
yeah, okay.
It was a wonderful session.
Thank
Coming on to next. I will ask Maharashtra State Chapter President, Dr. Milind Kolsar, to put some highlights on today's webinar. Over to Kolsar.
Maharashtra State Chapter of Anesthesiology is among the dynamic state chapters of IIT. The credit goes mainly to the enthusiastic branches of MSCI. We conduct round about 30 to 40 CMEs per year through our branches. Since this corona pandemic, physical CMEs are not possible. Many of our branches have been stuck up academic activities. Some branches have started webinars, but many enthusiastic branches are finding it difficult about conducting the webinars. Now, this is our moral responsibility to help our branches, and hence MSCISA has come up with a digital platform for webinars. All you have to do is plan a webinar, choose topic, choose faculties, and inform our Honorary Secretary Dr. Balaji Asera. He will guide you in every aspect to conduct the webinar. The webinars will be of MSCISA and hosted by city branch like our conferences. Today only, Maharashtra Medical Council has granted credit hours to webinars. It is one of the good news. First of such webinar is taking place today. A nice, excellent presentation by Dr. Nita Deshpande regarding, and it is really important in view of our busy schedule and the stress we are having in day-to-day practice. So very much thankful to Dr. Nita Deshpande for nice presentation. I congratulate Solapur Anesthesia Society for coming forward for this first webinar. I appeal to all city branches of MSCISA to take advantage of this digital platform. If you have new ideas and suggestions about webinars, please feel free to communicate with either myself, Dr. Milind Kaur, President, Dr. Chandrasekhar Cham, our Vice President, Dr. Manisha Katikar, our President-elect, Dr. Balaji Asegaonkar, our Honorary Secretary. We look forward for many such webinars under MSCI. Thank you.
Thank you, Kolsar. Now we are coming to the next session. Use of balanced salt solution in COVID-19 patients by Dr. Sandeep Bhavkar. Dr. Sandeep is manager of medical affairs in Freshness Cabinet. Dr. Sandeep.
Hello,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes, yes. You are audible.
Is my screen visible?
Some lights. Yes,
Sir.
sir. Audible. Yes.
Yes, visible.
Thank you so much. Okay, fine. Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you for joining in, and also I thank Solapur Anesthesiologist Society for giving me this opportunity to present this relevant topic in this current COVID-19 situation. So, what I am going to do cover in this topic is current fluid management guidelines in COVID-19 situation, which are very relevant to this current scenario, and I am going to cover a couple of clinical trial data and the relevance and the mechanism behind these slides. Okay. So to begin talking about the COVID-19 situation, so a lot of things have changed since we first heard the name Corona, what is known as currently COVID-19. So over the past 6 or 7 months, we have seen that a lot of publications have come across. And if you look at the statistics of this publication, every week more than 4,000 publications are getting published in various journal on various topics. So it is very easy to get lost in all this kind of data. But what I'm going to cover today is just very relevant points, summary kind of situation where only the guidelines have been covered, and in that guidelines, what is the recommended related to the fluid management. Okay. So beginning with the topic balanced crystalloids in COVID-19 situation. So basic thing that everyone has to remember is that though COVID-19 is a novel coronavirus and we are still we are still yet to come up with the proper treatment and definite management of the COVID-19 situation, some of the principles of management of critically ill patients and the principles of management of septic shock apply to COVID-19 situation as well. So here a very important role comes of the fluid management. So fluid resuscitation and hemodynamic management form a very strong pillars of the management of critical ill cases and management of septic shock cases. So what do we want to achieve with the fluid resuscitation? So what role does the fluid replenishment play in a hospitalized case? Okay, so it is required to provide daily basal fluid requirement. It is essential to maintain or achieve normovolumic and hemodynamic stability. Resuscitation of fluid balance between different fluid compartments. So here we look at the intravascular compartment, intracellular compartment, extracellular compartment. Depending upon the compartment which is affected, actually the fluid has to be selected. So one very important thing that we have to look at here is fluid prescription or fluid. When we give fluid, it has to be treated like drugs. So different indications require different drugs. In the same format, fluid management has to be tailored according to the indication for which it is given. Then next indication, for example, for fluid resuscitation is to maintain adequate plasma colloid osmotic pressure. Then also to enhance the microvascular blood flow and subsequently to normalize the oxygen delivery to tissue cells and cellular metabolism. So these are all the different indications for fluid resuscitation measures. And it is also important to have a proper balanced fluid therapy to prevent or moderate cascade system activation and trauma-induced increased blood coagulation. For relevant to understand the concepts of balanced crystalloid and how unbalanced crystalloid, for example, saline, affects the body and affects the interior of or homeostasis of the human system. So fluid management, as we come relate to different parts of the COVID-19 pandemic management, the evolution of the concepts is still taking place, but some concepts we have to understand, and these are all related to basic stuff that we have seen in the physiology. Okay, so during the early stages of COVID-19 pandemic, it was thought that okay, we have to aim for negative fluid balance. So that concept came from the concept of management of critical ill cases, where there were shown a lot of benefits of negative fluid balance. But here we have to identify the patients and the requirements of the patients, like in the same format in this currently situation also. We have to individualize the fluid management in every patient. So for example, if a patient comes and patient has the complaints of like tachypnea and there is a high grade fever, then there is an insensible loss of fluid, and we are not able to calculate what is the negative fluid balance or what fluid balance is actually required. At the same time, a lot of cases have come up with the acute during the course of COVID-19 treatment. So that will be related to the improper fluid management. So what my point that I'm trying to make here is less fluid or more fluid, both are harmful for the patient. So that is why we have to maintain a balance in not in terms of fluid selection, but in terms of also how much of the fluid are we giving. Now there are a lot of publications, many different guidelines. There is a lot of different rationale behind all these guidelines. I'm going to just summarize the very relevant guidelines to the COVID-19 situation, which are published since like last few months. So these are the surviving sepsis campaign guidelines for the management of critically ill adults with coronavirus 2019. So as per guidelines, these guidelines have taken evidence in which they have used for formulating surviving sepsis campaign guidelines for critically ill adults. So these guidelines are not formulated just basis on the COVID-19 and shock cases. So that is why the rationale, if you look at this, the rationale is based on the overall evidence that we have generated in critical ill cases. So to cover some of the guidelines in adults with COVID-19 and shock, first of all, we have to look at the dynamic parameters such as capillary refill time, serum lactate measurements. Then we are going to see subsequently the stroke volume variability, pulse pressure variability, passive leg raise test. So these all parameters should be looked at. So these are the dynamic parameter. We should be considered by selecting the amount of fluid and how much of the fluid should be given. Then comes the selection of fluid, which fluid should be selected. So first, very basic rule is in all critical ill cases and in COVID-19 and shock cases, avoid all sorts of colloids. So avoid hydroxyethyl starch, avoid albumin, avoid gelatin. Okay, even the fresh fluid FFPs should be avoided. So colloids are not to be given in cases of COVID-19 and shock. The fluid that has to be preferred are crystalloids over colloids, and among balanced crystalloids or buffered crystalloids are to be preferred over unbuffered crystalloids. So the talk today is about the balanced crystalloid in COVID-19 situation. So the guideline clearly mention, clearly recommend that for acute resuscitation of adults with COVID-19 and shock, preference should be given to buffered crystalloids or balanced crystalloids over unbalanced crystalloids. Coming to WHO guideline, so patients with COVID-19 and respiratory failure should be treated cautiously with intravenous IV fluid, especially in settings where there is less availability of mechanical ventilation, okay, or the patient has hypoxia at the time of presentation. Initially, a conservative fluid management strategy for ARDC patients without tissue hypoperfusion should be advised, but at the same time, the responsiveness to the fluid should be also taken place. Then, in resuscitation for septic shock in adults, give 250 to 500 ml of crystalloid fluid as a rapid bolus in first 15 to 30 minutes, and also after that reassess for signs of fluid overload after each bolus. How to reassess the signs of fluid overload? So here comes the role of dynamic fluid monitoring. Okay, all the tests that we have seen so far. If there is no response to fluid loading, or if there are signs of volume overload present, then reduce the fluid administration or discontinue fluid administration. Consider dynamic indices of volume responsiveness whenever the fluid resuscitation has been begun with. Now, these indices include passive leg raises, fluid challenges with serial stroke volume variability assessment, or variation in systolic pressure, pulse pressure variability, IVC size, or stroke volume in response to the changes in intrathoracic pressure during mechanical ventilation. WHO guidelines also mention that avoid colloids, avoid starches, gelatin, or albumin, and hypotonic solutions are less effective as compared to isotonic solutions at increasing the intravascular volume. As you know, the tonicity of the fluids with hypotonic solutions, there's a less chances that the IV intravascular volume will increase to that extent as compared to isotonic solutions. Now, these are the guidelines from UK Joint Anesthetic and Intensive Care Association, where they have mentioned clearly that balanced electrolyte solution are preferred to saline and colloids. While fluid overload should be avoided and more conservative administration may help in improving the respiratory function, this should be balanced against the risk of inducing acute renal impairment. So it's not just the restrictive or conservative strategy, but individualized case-based decision has to be taken place. and care should be exercised in running patients to dry in an effort to spare the lungs, as there are increased insensible fluid losses like we have seen from tachypnea or high-grade fever. These are the NIH guidelines. So as per these guidelines, again, use dynamic parameters, capillary refilling time, skin temperature, or serum lactate measurements over static parameters to assess fluid responsiveness. And for acute resuscitation, use balanced crystalloids over unbalanced crystalloids. Recommendation is against the use of colloids, all sorts of colloids, and norepinephrine should be used as a first choice vasopressor whenever it is available. And the panel recommends against the use of dopamine. The low dose dopamine for renal doses should be avoided as per the recommendation. Now we have covered the recommendation, be it surviving sepsis, NIH, or WHO guidelines. Everywhere it is clearly highlighted to go for crystalloid and to go for balanced crystalloid in COVID-19 cases, and everywhere it is clearly mentioned to avoid saline. What is the rationale behind this? What is the molecular basis behind this? That is very clearly correlated with what is the outcome in COVID-19 situation when it comes to the organ damage cases. So as you all know that kidney damage is associated with in-hospital mortality in patients with COVID-19, and kidney damage chances and the percentage prevalence, we can say, is very high. So one thing to be remembered is clinicians should increase the awareness of kidney damage in patients with COVID-19 situation. Now, what is the relation with balanced crystalloid therapy, selection of balanced crystalloid, and kidney disease outcome? So the rationale, if you look at all these guidelines, is taken from one very important landmark study, I would say, that was published in NEJM in 2018. This trial is known as SMART trial. So at the balanced crystalloid versus saline in critically ill adults. So this trial was conducted in Vanderbilt University. In this university, they randomized the patients to balanced crystalloid and saline. So all those patients who were admitted to critically ill ICU setup, so they were given either saline or balanced crystalloid solution, and they looked at the primary endpoint, that is MAKE 30 criteria. Now MAKE 30 is major advanced kidney event within 30 days of hospital administration. This is a composite endpoint, composites of risk of death, renal replacement therapy requirement, and persistent creatinine elevation. So these are all parameters related to the overall health of the kidneys. And from this landmark trial, from the 15,000 patients, what was findings were that MAKE 30 was observed in 15.4% cases receiving saline, as opposed to 14.3% cases receiving balanced crystalloid. So there is 1.1% reduction in the kidney worsening of kidney outcomes in patients receiving balanced crystalloid. And this conclusion, the authors have also commented that replacing saline with balanced crystalloid might prevent one patient among every 94 patients admitted to ICU from requirement of either renal replacement therapy. It might be renal transplant, it might be hemodialysis, it might be peritoneal dialysis, or persistent renal dysfunction, or from death. So balanced crystalloid as compared to saline in critically ill adults improves all the parameters related to kidney outcomes. And as we have seen, COVID-19 and kidney outcomes are directly correlated, and that we have to be watchful for. This is a subgroup analysis from the same trial where the 1,641 patients were selected from the medical ICU only. Earlier, the 15,000 patients were from all ICUs, but from those patients, only patients with septic shock were isolated, and there was subgroup analysis. And here they compared again the mortality, they compared the norepinephrine requirement, and they found out that compared to balanced crystalloid, saline required higher norepinephrine, as you can see from this graph, and lower doses of vasopressor and lower duration of vasopressin requirement was seen with balanced crystalloids. Now look, after this clinical trial, after this landmark trial, one would think that what is wrong with saline? So very basic, simple understanding is, look at the human plasma concentration of different electrolytes and look at the electrolytes that we are providing with saline. So osmolarity of human plasma is around 290, whereas it is 308 with saline. More importantly is chloride concentration in human plasma is around 94, and with saline we are giving the chloride concentration that is 50% more. So that is 154 millimole per liter. So in short, with saline, when we administer saline, we are giving hypotonic, potentially hypotonic solution where other electrolytes are absent, and it has supraphysiological chloride levels which can lead to hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. Why this hyperchloremic acidosis develops? Because the negatively charged ions are over more in levels as compared to positively charged ions. That is why bicarbonate level go down. One important point here again is that in saline there are no bicarbonates or bicarbonate precursor. So there is no buffer system in saline as compared to there is buffer system in human plasma that gets compromised. Now, coming to the anesthesia relevance or the surgical relevance of the outcome, there are a lot of studies. I have only highlighted one study where it is shown that hyperchloremia after non-cardiac surgery is independently associated with increased morbidity and mortality. So it was a retrospective trial showed that from this graph it very clearly showed that as the chloride levels go increasing with every 5 to 10 millimole per liter increase in chloride, probability of death, as you can see from the y-axis, goes on increasing. So this is not related to any critical ill cases. This is not related to any septic shock. This is just post-operative outcome and morbidity, mortality related to the chlorine level. I summarize this with a basic physiological principle that we have seen in our first year of MBBS, that tubulo-glomerular feedback is mediated by chloride concentration. Whenever the body responds to high GFR, so as a result of high GFR, macular densa cells receive high concentration of chloride. So the kidneys or body will sense that there is excess of chloride in the system. How it will try to compensate that? It will compensate that by causing the afferent arterial constriction. So initial event is high GFR, outcome is the high chloride level to the denser cell, and then resultant body response is that afferent arterial vasoconstriction. But when GFR normal level and high amount of chloride, the form of saline administration, kidneys will still change the high chloride load as a increase in GFR. So the overall outcome is that macular denser cells will still receive high chlorine. They will still cause afferent arterial constriction, even though GFR is normal. So overall outcome is decrease in GFR, decrease in renal blood flow, decrease in urine output and sodium output. So I am sure that most of you must have seen that patients overloaded with normal saline or saline administration in post-operative setup in the when the patients are admitted in the post-op unit, their kidney urine output might be different from those patients who are receiving balanced crystalloid. So if anyone has not looked at it, I will request everyone that subsequently keep an eye on that, then it will be very much evident to everyone. So what is crystalloid solution? So ideal crystalloid solution is solution which is calcium free balanced crystalloid solution where acetate and gluconate act as a precursor to bicarbonate. So there is no chance of acidosis development, and the sodium and chloride are very much equivalent to the concentration that we see in the human plasma. So that is a composition of ideal crystalloid solution. And to summarize the talk, we looked at the guidelines, we looked at the rationale behind this guideline, and we looked at the physiological principles and what goes wrong with saline in our system. To summarize the talk, I would just mention that general principles of fluid management in critical care provides the foundation of therapy of COVID-19. The COVID-19 fluid management should be balanced, not in terms of amount of fluid, but in terms of selection of the fluid. So it is important to take the concise patient history, his clinically assessment of the patient, and individualize the fluid therapy. There are several guidelines which are published, including the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines, WHO and UK Joint Anesthetic and Intensive Care guidelines. Now, the rationale they took from the critical care patients, which were studied for so many years, and the evidence, a lot of evidence is generating in favor of balanced crystalloid. The same evidence they have applied for COVID-19 and shock cases as well. So balanced crystalloid should be preferred over saline, and starches should be avoided, gelatin should be avoided, all colloids should be avoided, because in COVID-19 in septic shock cases you must knowing that there is endothelial disruption. So there are chances of colloids coming into the extravascular space. So first preference, all the recommendations prefer crystalloids, and among crystalloid, balanced crystalloid should be preferred. And I'm sure that after the COVID-19 era is over, when we go back to the normal practice as well, in ICU setup, the saline has to be replaced. It is going to be the end of saline area, and more balanced crystalloid will be utilized in the clinical practice. So thank you everyone for patient hearing. At the same time, along with balanced crystalloid, there is also very important concepts of avoiding nosocomial infection. So in COVID-19, we know that we are avoiding the AC installation as well. So in that same format, to avoid nosocomial infection, the importance of closed system, like everything has to be sterilized, everything has to be reaching to the patient in closed system. In that same format, the Fresenius Kabi 1 FreeFlex system takes care of that closed system and avoidance of nosocomial infection. So there is very short, brief 2 minutes video. I would request the studio to play that video, and after the video, we will take the questions and any discussion if we want to continue. Can you play the video, please? Hello?
Studio, can you please play the video?
At these times, nosocomial infections have a new meaning in the coronavirus pandemic. Nosocomial infections are the infections which develop to a previously healthy patient coming to the hospital for other treatment, but gets infected after 48 hours of admittance. This happens because the hospital and ICU settings have pathogens lurking in the atmosphere. These airborne infections can enter directly into the bloodstream of admitted patients through the IV bottle of saline administered to almost every patient. In an ICU or hospital, there are multiple infections in the atmosphere, which through the poor ventilation and close patient vicinity, get transferred into the vein of the patient. Infusion systems are an important part of overall surgical and ICU care. These systems are either open or closed. All open systems or semi-closed systems that are fully not collapsible require an air vent to fully drain into the vein of the patient. Usage of the open systems, like plastic and glass bottles, can increase 54% of mortality rate due to hospital-acquired infections. The chances of contamination in an open system are 10 times higher than closed system, like the collapsible bag. Closed infusion system is superior to open system in providing prevention against hospital-acquired infections. Hence, it is now time to break this chain of hospital-acquired infections. Introducing the new innovation from the leaders in volume therapy worldwide. FreeFlex DEHP-free, non-PVC environment-friendly solution to infusion therapy. Sterilized at 121 degrees centigrade within secondary wrap, hence no re-sterilization required. It ensures maximum asepsis of the primary bag. FreeFlex bag is made of polyolefin and is water vapor resistant, so no adsorption of drugs on the inner surface of the bag. FreeFlex bag is self-collapsible bag, and therefore, does not require any air vent. FreeFlex bag has innovative infusion and injection ports, specially designed for safe and easy handling. It has rigid sterile injection and infusion ports. Therefore, force required to pierce is adequate, hence prevents needle stick injury. The ports are sterile and have tamper-evident break-off caps with color and arrow indications. Membrane below cover is aseptic, disinfection of the membrane is not necessary. The ports are self-sealed to prevent leakage even after multiple spiking. FreeFlex has an excellent drug compatibility with over 40 commonly used IV drugs. Fresenius Kabi has TGA, WHO, FDA Taiwan, and NDA Uganda approved plants, which export to Australia. From the makers of Innovative Infusion System Solutions, we offer you a range of fully closed system bags. FreeFlex Standard Solution, Kabi Light FreeFlex, Volu Light, Kabi Mol, Voluvan, and Kabi Solid. Together, we can create an infection-free world with Freeflex, a state-of-the-art, award-winning innovative patented bag like none other across the market.
Yes, thank you all. So if any questions or any points to be discussed,
Thank you, Sandeep, for a very informative and clear message for avoid bolides in COVID patients and use of comfort solutions esoteric comfort in all routine surgeries to avoid hyperchloremic acidosis and use of reflex. Okay, thank you very much. Now I will request our clinical secretary, Dr. Madhura Gurte, to give vote of thanks.
Hello all. I, Dr. Madhura, on behalf of Solapur Anesthesiologists Society, would like to thank our honorable dignitaries with us. Respected Dr. Ashok Deshpande, National GC member, respected Dr. Milind Pol, President, Dr. Chandrasekhar Cham, Vice President, Dr. Manisha Katikar, President-elect, Dr. Balaji Asegaonkar, Secretary, Dr. Sangeeta Deshpande, Treasurer, Dr. Shubhangi Kothari, Editor, Maharashtra State Chapter of ISA. I would like to thank our esteemed speakers, Dr. Neeta Deshpande and Dr. Sandeep Bhabkar, who have won the hearts of our audience with excellent academic feast on these interesting topics. I would like to extend our thanks to team of Fresenius Kabi for wonderful arrangements and support. And last but not the least, for the excellent audience we have today who have given their valuable time and for their patient listening. Thank you so much all.
Thank you, Madhura. Now I call Vijay Joshi, Zonal Manager of Fresenius Kabi. He also want to give vote of thanks. Vijay Joshi.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ashok, Dr. Milind, Dr. Chandrasekhar, Dr. Manisha, Dr. Balaji, Dr. Sangeeta, Dr. Sudhangi, and Dr. Sangeeta Page, Dr. Santosh, and Dr. Ganesh. I deem it a great honor to propose the vote of thanks and to all who have helped us making this webinar grand successful. You know, the more than 700 registration itself explain that the success of this particular webinar. So already we have conveyed our thanks to our speaker, Dr. Sandeep and Dr. Neeta. And thank you very much, Solapur Anesthesia Society, and thank you very much, Maharashtra State Society, for conducting such nice program, webinar. And I would extend my thanks to our Fresenius Kabi team also, mainly Mr. Gajanan, Dr. Amit Sinde, Dr. Dhananjay, and Dhanraj. They helped us a lot to, make this event successful. And thank you for thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for making the event grand successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. Now, I would like to conclude our webinar. Thank you very much.